This is Sweden, the country every progressive politician cites as proof that the welfare state works. And it's quietly falling apart. 317 bombings last year, Europe's highest rate of gun deaths, an 810,000-person waiting list for housing in Stockholm alone. And the reason behind it will challenge everything you thought you knew about welfare states. So how did the country that invented hygge-adjacent living end up with more bombings than anywhere else in Europe? And why did nobody warn you? Here's why this matters beyond Scandinavia. Every politician promising you Nordic-style healthcare, housing, or social safety nets is selling you a model that's cracking in real time. Sweden was the model. Tax to GDP ratio of 41.4%. Universal healthcare. World-beating equality metrics. Countries from Canada to New Zealand cite the Swedish model when expanding social programs. Then, in September 2023, their own Prime Minister said this.
Sweden has never seen anything like this. No other country in Europe is experiencing anything like this.
By January 2025, he admitted the government had lost control over organized crime violence. Meanwhile, household debt sits at 150 to 200% of gross income, among the highest in Europe. Half of all Swedish mortgages are variable rate. Families one rate hike from disaster. The question isn't whether Sweden can fix its problems, it's whether the entire theory of the generous welfare state can survive contact with reality. To understand why Sweden broke, we need to go back to when it worked, and more importantly, why it worked. Let's start with what Sweden actually was, not what politicians tell you it was. 1928. A politician named Per Albin Hansson gives a speech about Folkhemmet, the people's home. The idea was simple: the nation as one big family. Everyone contributes, everyone benefits. By 1950, Sweden was the fourth richest economy on the planet. Public spending was still under 20% of GDP. 90% of businesses were privately owned. Let that sink in. This wasn't socialism. This was capitalism with a safety net, built on a foundation of extraordinary wealth that already existed. And here's the part nobody mentions. Sweden in 1940 was one of the most homogeneous populations on Earth, only about 1% foreign-born. Shared language, shared culture, shared values, extraordinary social trust. Oh, and in 1942, they introduced rent control as a temporary wartime measure. Spoiler, it's still in place 83 years later, and it would come back to haunt them in ways nobody predicted. Here's the uncomfortable truth the Fraser Institute documented. The period of massive government expansion from 1970 to 1995 was actually Sweden's worst economic performance period relative to its peers. The wealth came first. The welfare state came second, not the other way around. Why does this matter? Because the model was built on a society that already worked. High trust, cultural cohesion, wealth accumulated before redistribution began. Fast forward to 1976. The Social Democrats lose power after 44 consecutive years, partly because of absurd marginal tax rates. How absurd? The beloved children's author Astrid Lindgren, yes, the Pippi Longstocking lady, wrote a satirical essay exposing that she paid 102% marginal tax, more than she earned. The essay helped bring down a government. Then came 1975. Sweden officially changed its immigration policy from assimilation to integration. Immigrants were now encouraged to maintain their home cultures rather than adopt Swedish norms. The 1990s hit hard. Banking crisis. The Riksbank raised interest rates to 500% to defend the krona. That's not a typo. 500%. The crisis cost 64 billion kroner in bank bailouts, and construction collapsed, from 67,000 new housing units annually down to just 12,000. The housing shortage that would define Sweden's future had begun. By 2023, Sweden's Gini coefficient, that's the measure of inequality, had risen from 22.1 in 1975 to 29.3, one of the fastest-growing inequalities in the entire OECD. So much for the egalitarian paradise. Sweden built a generous welfare state on the foundation of a rich, homogeneous, high-trust society. Then they made one assumption that would break everything. They assumed everyone who came would become Swedish.
Here's what nobody tells you. Experts saw this coming 30 years ago. In the 1990s, Sweden's National Council of Building Research published a study warning of risk of parallel societies, gangs, and organized crime. Problems now topping the headlines. What happened to those researchers? They were called racists. Their careers were destroyed. One researcher, Carl Olof Arnsberg, lost his university position, his friends, and his wife for writing critically about multiculturalism. The Swedes have a term for this, the opinion corridor, the narrow range of acceptable opinions. Step outside it, and you disappeared. But warnings are easy to ignore when the economy is good and the problems are in other people's neighborhoods. Until 2015, when 162,000 people arrived in 4 months. Let me give you the exact numbers. 2014, 81,301 asylum seekers. 2015, 162,877 asylum seekers. That's a 100% increase in 1 year. Per capita, Sweden took 1,600 refugees per 100,000 inhabitants. The EU average was 250. At the peak in October and November 2015, more than 10,000 people were arriving every single week. 51,000 Syrians, 42,000 Afghans, including 21,000 unaccompanied minors, 21,000 Iraqis. And here's a detail that matters. 115,000 men versus 48,500 women. If you're thinking this sounds like a setup for disaster, you're absolutely right. But it gets worse. Watch the timeline. August 16, 2014. Prime Minister Fredrik Reinfeldt gives his famous "Open Your Hearts" speech, urging Swedes to accept refugees. September 6, 2015. Prime Minister Stefan Löfven declares, "My Europe does not build walls." November 5, 2015. Migration Minister Morgan Johansson admits, "All countries have a limit. This is where we are now." November 12, 2015, 12 noon. Sweden reintroduces border controls for the first time in 20 years. November 24, 2015. The historic press conference. Löfven announces the complete reversal. Deputy Prime Minister Åsa Romson breaks down in tears on camera. Löfven's exact words? "It pains me that Sweden is no longer capable of receiving asylum seekers at the high level we do today. We simply cannot do any more." From "My Europe doesn't build walls" to "We simply cannot do any more." 11 weeks. Now here's where the math gets brutal. Native-born Swedish employment rate, 82.9%. Foreign-born employment rate, 59.6%. That's a gap of 23.3 percentage points, the highest negative gap of 28 OECD countries surveyed. Of those 163,000 asylum seekers in 2015, fewer than 500 found jobs that year. Why? Sweden's economy is highly skilled. Only 5% of Swedish jobs require just primary education. There's no entry-level labor market for unskilled workers to climb into. And here's the kicker. It takes approximately 20 years for African and Asian immigrants to reach employment levels close to native-born Swedes. 20 years. Long-term unemployment? 32% for immigrants versus 12% for native Swedes. Remember that temporary 1942 rent control? Here's where it explodes. 810,000 people on the Stockholm housing waiting list. Let that sink in. Up from just 100,000 in the year 2000. The average wait for central Stockholm? 9 to 18 years. For subsidized housing? Up to 30. Only 0.5% of rental contracts return to the housing agency each year. Nobody gives up their apartment. Ever. So what happened? A black market emerged. Illegal rental contracts trading for 100 to 110 million euros annually. And in 2014, 5 murders in the Stockholm region were linked to that illegal rental contract trade. 255 of 290 Swedish municipalities reported housing shortages. So where did 162,000 new arrivals go? The only available housing? Already segregated public estates from the 1960s Million Program. Concentrated, isolated, no Swedish language environment. Meanwhile, for people who could buy, housing prices rose 260% over 20 years. That's 178% after inflation. Land prices alone increased 370% from 2000 to 2021. Before 2016, interest-only mortgages were the norm. Even after new amortization rules, 60% of loans below the 50% loan-to-value threshold remained interest-only. Household debt-to-income ratio? 150 to 200%, among the highest in Europe. And Sweden maintained a 30% mortgage interest tax deduction, the most generous in the EU, costing about 0.5% of GDP annually. Households now spend 18% of income on mortgage payments, up from 11%. So Sweden created the perfect conditions for parallel societies. No jobs for unskilled workers. No housing except in segregated estates. No integration infrastructure. The parallel society wasn't an accident. It was the only mathematical outcome. But parallel societies don't stay parallel forever. Eventually, they develop their own economies, their own rules, their own violence.
Remember those parallel societies we mentioned? Here's what grew inside them. 2006. 8 gun homicides in Sweden. 2022. 63 gun homicides, nearly an 8-fold increase. 391 shootings that year, the highest on record. Criminal networks so sophisticated that the U.S. Treasury sanctions their leaders. Europol creates task forces to hunt them, and 12-year-olds are recruited as contract killers for £20,000. In January 2026, Rawa Majid, known as the Kurdish Fox, leader of the Foxtrot network controlling most of Sweden's drug trade, was finally arrested in Iraq. Sweden is now the only European country where fatal shootings per capita increased since 2000. Prime Minister Kristersson called gang crime Sweden's second pandemic. He called criminals Sweden's domestic terrorists. The numbers are shocking, but the violence is just the symptom. The disease goes much deeper, and that's where it gets really uncomfortable. The real story isn't the violence. It's how long Sweden's political class pretended it wasn't happening, and why they couldn't fix it even when they tried. Think of Sweden's situation like a Chinese finger trap. The harder they pull in any direction, the tighter it gets. Cut immigration, the welfare state collapses. Maintain welfare, integration fails. Reform housing, governments fall. Every solution makes another problem worse. 317 bombings in 2024, more than doubled from 149 in 2023. Malin Nygren from the Swedish Bomb Data Center said it plainly. We have never seen anything like this. The only country with comparable hand grenade explosions per capita? Mexico, which has 20 times Sweden's murder rate. Police estimate 62 to 67,000 Swedes connected to criminal networks, 1,700 minors actively involved. And here's the data Sweden finally started publishing again. 80% of shooting victims have immigrant background. 64% of perpetrators have immigrant background. In 2022, 73 Swedish youths aged 15 to 20 were suspected of murder or attempted murder with firearms, up from 10 a decade earlier. Clearance rate for gun homicides in Sweden? 25%. In Germany and Finland? 90%. Sweden now designates 61 to 65 vulnerable areas where police cannot complete routine duties. The criteria? Parallel governance structures, systematic witness intimidation, informal justice systems. These areas contain about 5% of Sweden's population, but 50% of shooting incidents, 70% of individuals who traveled to conflict zones for terrorism were residents of these vulnerable areas. Specific neighborhoods you may have heard of: Rinkeby, Rosengård, Tensta, Angered. In 2010, 90% of Rinkeby residents had immigrant background. Watch what politicians said versus what was happening. 2017. Justice Minister Morgan Johansson stated, "The risk to innocent people was small." 2020. Prime Minister Löfven rejected police chief's claims linking gang crime to migration. Deputy Police Chief Mats Löfving identified 40-plus criminal clan gangs that moved to Sweden solely to organize crime. Politicians kept repeating, "We have been naive." It became a national punchline. Integration Minister Erik Ullenhag claimed the problems would resolve themselves in 20 to 25 years. By the way, Sweden stopped publishing immigration crime statistics after 2005. For 20 years, the government literally made it impossible to see the pattern. Make of that what you will. September 28, 2023. Soha Saad, a 24-year-old newly qualified teacher, was killed by a bomb while sleeping in her apartment, likely a mistaken target. Between 2011 and 2020, 46 bystanders killed or wounded, 8 victims under age 15. That same September 2023, 3 children, ages 13, 14, and 14, found executed in woods outside Stockholm. 11 people shot dead that month, the deadliest on record. If you're wondering why Sweden can't just fix this, here's where it gets truly frustrating. Each problem feeds the next, creating a cycle that's almost impossible to break. It starts with the labor market. Sweden's economy is highly skilled. Only 5% of jobs require just primary education. Compressed wages mean there's no economic incentive to hire low-skilled workers, and generous welfare benefits create a rational choice to not work. So new arrivals can't find jobs. Without jobs, they can't afford housing. But here's the housing lock-in. That 1942 rent control means nobody gives up their apartment, ever. So 255 of 290 municipalities report shortages. New arrivals get funneled into the only available housing, already segregated public estates from the 1960s Million program.
This creates what economist Tino Sanandaji calls the fundamental incompatibility. You can't combine open borders with a welfare state. The math is brutal. 58% of welfare payments go to immigrants. 65% of social welfare expenditures go to foreign background households. The system is paying people it can't employ to live in housing that doesn't exist. Integration programs don't fix this. The OECD found in 2016 that only 39% of men and 26% of women were in work or study 1 year after completing the introduction program. Each trap feeds the next. Pull on any string, the whole thing tightens. Now, before we paint Denmark as a model, the European Court of Justice ruled their ghetto laws potentially discriminatory in December 2025. The case is still in Danish courts. But here's the thing. The crime statistics don't care about court rulings. Denmark did integration differently. Strict love, 9 years residency for citizenship, comprehensive language test, 45-question citizenship test, 3.5 years of full-time work required. In 2002, they cut welfare benefits by 40% for non-EU immigrants. In 2018, the ghetto laws, housing demolitions, mandatory daycare, double penalties for crimes in designated areas. The result? Gang-related shootings decreased remarkably since 2017, and the fatal shootings comparison is brutal. In 2023, Sweden had 53. Denmark, Norway, and Finland, combined, about 6. Norway has a different buffer, a $2.2 trillion sovereign wealth fund, about $385,000 per citizen. It covers 25% of government spending. They can cushion welfare costs without the same fiscal pressure. Sweden has no oil, no sovereign wealth fund, no easy escape hatch. Here's what both left and right get wrong. Sweden's problem isn't that they were too generous or that they were racist. The problem is that they built a system requiring high social trust and cultural homogeneity, then imported massive diversity without adjusting the system. The model wasn't designed for this. No one asked whether it could be. So Sweden built a trap they can't escape. A generous welfare state that only works with high employment, feeding a population that can't find employment, in housing that doesn't exist, while politicians pretended nothing was wrong. What they did next shocked even their own supporters and revealed the final, devastating irony.
And here's where even the skeptics have to admit, Sweden actually did something about it. 2010. The Sweden Democrats first enter parliament with 5.7%, a party the mainstream called neo-Nazi adjacent, untouchable, beyond the pale. 2018. They become the third largest party with 17.5%. 2022. They win 20.5%, second largest party. October 14, 2022. The TIDE Agreement. For the first time ever, the Sweden Democrats have formal influence over government policy. October 17, 2022. Ulf Kristersson becomes Prime Minister with Sweden Democrat support. The vote? 176 to 173. Watch the reversal. Asylum immigration is now at the lowest level since 1985. Refugee quota, cut from 5,000 to 900 annually. New policy, pay immigrants up to 350,000 kroner, about $34,000, to voluntarily leave. Residence requirement for citizenship extended to 8 years. In 2024, Sweden achieved negative net immigration for the first time in 50 years. The current government slogan? Sweden should be in no respect more generous than the EU minimum.
October 1st, 2024. Stricter citizenship requirements enacted. Mid-2025. Work permit salary requirement raised to 100% of median Swedish salary. April 1st, 2025. Rejected asylum seekers can no longer transition to work permits. In September 2023, Kristersson addressed the nation. Sweden has never seen anything like this. No other country in Europe is experiencing anything like this. It is political naivety and ignorance that has brought us here. It is an irresponsible immigration policy and failed integration that has brought us here. But here's the devastating irony nobody wants to discuss. 52% of nurses in the Stockholm region are foreign-born. About 30% nationally of elderly care workers are foreign-born. A regional newspaper headline last year: "Without immigration, elderly care falls apart." The welfare state that can't integrate immigrants also can't function without them. Whether the reversal is enough, or whether it's already too late, is the question that keeps economists up at night. So what happens now? Can Sweden actually fix this? And what does it mean for every other country trying to build a generous welfare state?
Here's where things get strange. By almost every traditional economic metric, Sweden is doing fine. And that's the paradox that should make you deeply uncomfortable. A credit rating, maintained by all three agencies. Public debt at only 35% of GDP, well below most developed economies. GDP growth forecast of 1.6 to 2.6% through 2027. Most unicorns per capita in Europe. 8th globally in the IMD World Competitiveness Ranking. And here's something that might surprise you. 2024 homicides totaled 92, actually the lowest in a decade, down from 121 in 2023. Shootings have decreased from 391 in 2022 to 262 in 2024. New proactive police methods are working. The crisis is real, but it's a crisis of a rich country, not a collapsing one. On housing, forecasters expect 2 to 7% annual price growth through 2026. In April 2026, mortgage rules are relaxing. The loan-to-value cap rises from 85 to 90%. No housing crash expected. But the structural shortage of 150,000 units remains, and rent control reform? Still politically toxic. It collapsed a government in 2021. Dragonfly Intelligence predicts gang violence will probably occur frequently in 2025. Authorities will struggle to substantially contain gangs. But the trajectory has shifted. The new national strategy against organized crime has 5 objectives. Stop criminal careers before they start. Reduce illegal firearms. Destroy the criminal economy. Build resistance to unlawful influence. And safeguard identification systems. June 1st, 2026 brings major labor immigration reform. Salary thresholds rise to 90% of median wage. Stricter employer compliance. The tap is closing. So where does Sweden go from here? Scenario 1. Muddle through. Most likely. Violence stabilizes at elevated levels. Slow integration progress over 20-plus years. Housing shortage persists. Sweden becomes a normal European country rather than an exceptional model. Scenario 2. The Denmark path. Optimistic. Stricter enforcement actually works. Vulnerable areas reduce over a decade. Employment gaps narrow. The model survives in modified form. Scenario 3. Permanent dysfunction. Pessimistic. Integration failure continues. Criminal networks entrench further. Political polarization deepens. The welfare state gradually gets defunded. The Swedish model becomes a cautionary tale rather than an aspiration. Here's the uncomfortable truth neither side wants to hear. Sweden is still, by most metrics, a successful country. A credit rating, high employment, world-class innovation, low corruption. The question isn't whether Sweden survives, it's whether the idea of Sweden survives. The belief that you can have open borders and generous welfare and social cohesion. That experiment has produced the data. The data says, pick two. So what's the takeaway? Sweden didn't fail because they were too generous. They didn't fail because they were racist. They failed because they built a system with hidden requirements, high trust, cultural homogeneity, wealth generated before redistribution, and then changed the inputs without changing the system. Every country citing the Nordic Model should ask one question first. Do you have what Sweden had in 1950? Because if you don't, you're not copying their success. You're copying their crisis. And if you haven't seen our deep dive into Brazil's commodity curse, why the country of the future always stays in the future, check it out. Links on screen. Now I want to hear from you. Will Sweden fix this in a decade? Or will we be doing a follow-up video called How Sweden Collapsed? Drop your prediction in the comments.